Somebody's going to beat him to the punch. He's not going to get credit for it. Darwin didn't really see the threat. He didn't think that Wallace's ideas were a threat to his own publications. So on the 1st of July in 1858, Wallace's paper is presented to the Linnean Society. And it was actually meant to be presented jointly with a paper by Darwin. Darwin couldn't attend because his son had recently died. So Wallace presents his paper. Turns out Darwin was right. The ideas really were fairly similar, but Wallace's paper doesn't really make a big impression on scientists of the time. There's not a lot of attention that's given to his theories. In May of 1859, so about 10, 11 months later, the president of the Linnean Society actually commented that there were no revolutionary discoveries over the past year. So he just sort of dismisses Wallace's ideas of natural selection and evolution. And then finally, about a year later, the 22nd of November in 1859, Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species. And it is unexpectedly popular. You know, after the debacle with Wallace, nobody would really care all that much. The entire stock, he had 1,250 manuscripts. The entire stock was oversubscribed on the first day that it went on sale. So it sold out almost immediately. And the theory that he presented is really stated reasonably clearly within the introduction there. So I'm just going to read you the introduction that he has. He says, as many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as consequently there is a frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any being, if it vary however slightly in any manner profitable to itself, will have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected. All right, so again, looking at this Malthusian idea of population dynamics, of limited resources, as well as how that would affect a population, that if they have some sort of adaptation that benefits them, that they're going to have a higher chance of mating, of breeding, and that those adaptations are going to be passed down. Now, while the intent of On the Origin of Species is fairly obvious, I think, Darwin never really uses the word evolution. And even at this time, I'm going back, 1859, 1860s, evolution was a fairly controversial term. He also only makes vague reference to humans. So he only really says that the effect of these thoughts on the human population will be discussed later. He doesn't really include humans in these ideas of natural selection. And On the Origin of Species, by far Darwin's most famous book, is actually only meant to be a sort of abstract, an introduction to his full theories, which he would then come out with later. So after On the Origin of Species was published, he did continue his research, and in 1871, about 12 years later, Darwin publishes The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. Now, this showed sort of evidence that humans were animals. I think that's a fairly, known fact now, that yes, humans are indeed animals as well. It wasn't necessarily seen that way at the time, but he also said that sexual selection explains the impractical features of animals like a peacock's tail, right? That you might not be able to figure out the exact function, but that because it's used in breeding and courtship, that some of those strange features that we see do have a purpose, and that those adaptations then serve an actual function. He also emphasized that humans were all one species, right? That there weren't various species, and this goes back to the first voyage of the Beagle. During that first voyage, when they abducted the Fuegians, the second voyage they took them back, and Darwin actually became friends with Jemmy Button along the voyage, and saw that he was a very nice guy, he was very civilized, he was just another person. He became very, very against the idea of slavery and the idea that these were sort of separate species that lived in the Americas. It had actually been determined in a French court that it was fine to subjugate the Native Americans because they weren't actually humans, so they didn't They didn't fall under God's love. So so Darwin really didn't believe this and placed a strong emphasis on that in his writings. Now, by the late 1800s, so within about 20 to 30 years of when Darwin published these findings, theories of evolution and natural selection were really widely accepted within the scientific community. Now, many of his theories, many of these ideas, as I sort of pointed to at the beginning of this presentation, were actually fairly widely accepted before Darwin came along. The fact that other scientists also reached the same conclusions, people like Wallace, also added a bit of weight. Now, the means of natural selection was actually discovered around the same time that Darwin published On the Origin of Species. And this is work that was done by Gregor Mendel on the left-hand side here. Now, Mendel was an Augustinian friar who was sort of inspired to study the variation in plants, and he showed that plant hybridization follows a predictable pattern. And he presented this at 2 meetings of the Natural History Society. Again, it wasn't really latched onto, it was just sort of thought that this was information about how to hybridize peas. Right? He was working primarily on pea plants. So nobody really paid much attention. It wasn't until around 1900, around the turn of the century, that the significance of the inheritance component of his work was actually understood. He's actually now called the father of modern genetics. Right? The fact that there are these genetic traits that are passed on. So Darwin didn't know about his work. He maybe knew some of Darwin's work, but even though their theories really combined, they never actually met one another. Now, Charles Darwin obviously didn't come up with these ideas on his own. There were a lot of people that went before him, but he really is most associated today with evolution. He's largely given credit for these ideas. He really came up with the fully incorporated theory of evolution and natural selection, sort of going hand in hand. And I just think this is a funny photo. You can see from the photo on the right, this was actually drawn shortly after Darwin published On the Origin of Species. Wasn't accepted by everyone, but this one, Charles Darwin will learn you on the origin of species. I hope that explains the evolution of evolution. Thank you guys all very much.